Cognitive behavioral therapy, treatment for eating disorders. In this presentation, we're going to talk about the wide range of cognitive behavioral intervention techniques that are brought to bear in relation to treating various eating disorders. Probably the most important place to begin is with the recognition that cognitive behavioral therapy is probably the most extensively studied therapeutic treatment for eating disorders. Just because it's the most extensively studied technique, however, doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most effective. In truth, most literature seems to suggest that a variety of different treatments, including cognitive behavioral, are equally effective. Various forms of attachment, it's a neodynamic approach, therapy, approaches that are based on humanistic or phenomenological, certainly oppression-sensitive, constructivist narrative techniques, and family systemic techniques are among those that have also been studied in relation to the treatment of eating disorders and found to be effective. But there are a number of features about cognitive behavioral therapy that make it an ideal candidate for research. Cognitive behavioral forms of therapy tend to be relatively directive, clear-cut, concrete, structured, systematic, and symptom-focused, and all of those things make them a good candidate for research purposes. When we talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, we're really talking about a very wide range of different forms of treatment that share a few things in common. Across the board, cognitive behavioral techniques and therapy tend to be relatively short-term, they tend to be highly structured, and they by and large derive from one of two different sources, either from Aaron Beck's early work with cognitive therapy and depression in the 1960s, or the work of Albert Ellis and his behavioral therapy techniques that would later become the basis of rational emotive therapy. Studies on cognitive behavioral therapy have consistently found that it leads to a greater reduction in eating disorder symptoms than either waitlist controls, no treatment, or medication alone. Again, some work has also shown that other forms of therapy show equal efficacy with cognitive behavioral approaches, but again, cognitive behavioral approaches are by far and away the most extensively studied approaches. Let's talk for a few minutes about some of the principles, the common ties that bind when it comes to the various expressions of cognitive behavioral therapy. All of the cognitive behavioral therapies are based on the central premise that our thoughts and not external people, situations, objects, or events are the cause of our feelings and our behaviors. It's not what happens to us so much as what we think about what happens to us that is the cause of our distress. If, for example, you were on an elevator in a crowded situation and you could barely turn or move and you felt somebody poke you in the back, and then again as you went up a couple more floors you felt again poked in the back, and a third time yet poked in the back again, you might find yourself getting frustrated and irritated, and it would seem as if you were frustrated and irritated because you were being poked in the back. However, as you exit the elevator, you turn around to see who this perpetrator is, and you find the individual is blind, and they have been inadvertently hitting you with their cane. Well, suddenly your entire reaction changes. You're not so angry, you're not so frustrated, you're not so irritated. And this highlights the fact that your frustration, your anger, and your irritation were not so much caused by the cane or by the blind person as they were by the meaning that you attributed to it. Here is an insensitive person who is violating my personal space and poking me in the back. So it's really the meaning that you attribute, the thoughts that you have about that particular object, event, situation, rather than the object, event, or situation itself that causes your feelings. All cognitive behavioral therapies tend to be relatively brief and time limited. By brief and time limited, this may be as little as 6 to 8 sessions or as much as 6 or 8 months. But they tend not to be, like traditional psychoanalytic therapy, for example, the kind of therapy that occurs several times per week across a several-year span of time. Cognitive behavioral therapies assume the importance of a good therapeutic relationship. They regard those as necessary but not as sufficient, and they tend not to be the focus of therapy. The focus of therapy tends to be on the techniques, on the interventions, and on aspects of the symptomatology that the person has, and not on the therapeutic relationship per se. The relationship is regarded as a form of collaboration, a collaborative empiricism in which the client and the therapist jointly fashion hypotheses or notions based on the client's thoughts and then test them out in the real world to see how accurate they are, to see how realistic they are, to see how rational they are, and then to change them, to alter them, or to restructure them to fit the reality of the situation. Cognitive behavioral therapies are based on the Stoic philosophy. Stoicism teaches that undesirable situations in life are inevitable. They're going to happen under any conditions, whether or not we're upset about them. So if we become upset about things that happen, we now have two problems instead of one. Stoicism emphasizes the benefits of feeling calm in the face of undesirable situations. You simply soldier forward, recognizing that bad things will happen. There's no sense in getting irritated about them. In a sense, by the time you get irritated about them, you now have the original problem itself, plus your own anger, frustration, depression, anxiety, jealousy, or whatever other negative emotion you may be plagued with. Cognitive behavioral therapies use the Socratic method. By that I mean they tend to ask questions of the client and also encourage the client to ask questions of their own design to challenge their thinking. The notion here is that what you think is not a given truth. It's not assumed to be right, correct, valid. Instead, it's assumed that it can be subject to testing. And so the question is, to what extent are my thoughts realistic? How well anchored are they in the reality of the situation? So the client is asked to then challenge the correctness or incorrectness, the rationality or irrationality of their thinking to see how well it really corresponds with the external reality of the situation. You can see how this would lead cognitive behavioral therapies to be relatively structured and directive, all about formulating cognitions and testing them out against the real world. This means that cognitive behavioral therapy in practice is often based on a sort of educational model, where the client is being taught quite literally to unlearn old behaviors and old thought patterns and to replace them with more functional and rational thoughts and behaviors. The notion is that the person literally has caused themselves and has learned a pattern of thinking that causes them to feel badly. So the notion is they have to learn a new model, a new method, new mechanisms for thinking differently, and as a function of that, feeling differently. In the cognitive behavioral field, there is the sort of adage about think straight, feel great, and it's the essential part of cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral forms of treatment rely on an inductive method. In other words, what they're doing is they're encouraging the client from the ground up to kind of look at their thoughts as kind of hypotheses rather than truths, and to test them out for supporting evidence in the outside world. How right, how wrong, how correct, or how incorrect are my assumptions? This often results in the use of homework with cognitive behavioral therapy. Different forms of treatment, different forms of therapy, different theoretical orientations advocate the use of homework to a different extent. And in truth, there's some variety in relation to cognitive behavioral forms of treatment as well. But across the board, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is more likely to use homework than most other therapies. The notion is that we can formulate here in the office during our therapy hour some notions, some hunches, some hypotheses, some experiments that can be tested out in the real world between sessions. And then you can come back and report on those. In working with eating disorders, the goal is to not overwhelm the client with a massive amount of homework, but to provide some ongoing continuity in treatment so that the client gradually learns to gain control over his or her own thoughts, or feelings. And homework, of course, is an ideal way to do that. In the 3 stages of cognitive behavioral therapy, there are somewhat different goals. In stage 1, the therapist explains the process of cognitive behavioral treatment and the rationale behind the treatment. Essentially, you can think about the picture of a sort of triangle and imagine that at the pinnacle are thoughts, and then at the 2 bottom points would be behaviors and feelings. And the notion in cognitive behavioral therapy is that what you think affects both how you feel and how you behave. So it's a simple concept and one of relative linear causation. Cognitive behavioral therapists recognize, of course, that just as thoughts change feelings and behaviors, behaviors can change thoughts or behaviors can change feelings, or feelings can change thoughts or behaviors. That is, there's a kind of reciprocal determinism. But the emphasis in cognitive behavioral therapy, as the name would imply, is really on changing the thoughts and then tracing the implications of those for how the person feels and what they do. This is the primacy of cognition within cognitive behavioral therapy, in part because it's easier to track thoughts, they can be subjected to being more rational, and they do have a kind of controlling influence over feelings. Feelings can be more difficult and slippery to get hold of. They can be less subject to rational disputation, and for that reason, they're oftentimes more difficult to intervene with in the same way that you can with cognitions. The therapist in the first stage of cognitive behavioral therapy emphasizes the importance of the client's ability to monitor themselves, self-monitoring, during his or her time between sessions. Self-monitoring is all about paying attention to what it is you do, what it is you feel, and what it is you think. And oftentimes there are journals or diaries or logs that the client completes that literally take note of what they're feeling at a given time, what they're saying to themselves at that time, and then what they're doing. Self-monitoring requires that you develop a kind of reflexive awareness, that you become aware of your own experience, you become aware of your own thoughts, and you become aware of the relationship between them. So the capacity to self-monitor, to pay attention to what you're thinking, feeling, and doing, is a really pivotal element in cognitive behavioral therapy. In self-monitoring, again, the client records, in the case of eating disorder, everything that they might eat on a daily basis. They put this out on a monitoring sheet, and they include things like what time of day they eat it, what they ate, where it was consumed, whether it led to any kinds of thoughts or feelings, any kinds of behaviors like purging. And they take note of what happens both before, during, and after that eating experience. In general, calorie counting in cognitive behavioral treatments of eating disorder is discouraged, in part because the goal is not to ramp up or intensify a kind of vigilance or awareness around how much the person's eating or the caloric intake of the food that they're eating, but rather to pay more attention to the other elements that provide a context for disturbed eating, things like what you're thinking and what you're feeling. Those become much more the object of attention than the number of calories per se. Of course, you may well think something different and feel something different if you're eating a bowl of fruit versus a bowl of ice cream. But the goal is not to pay attention to the different amount of calories in those cases, but rather the kinds of things you're telling yourself, like, you fat pig, you out of control monster, what's the matter with you, in the case of ice cream, whereas in the case of a bowl of fruit, you may well be telling yourself something more affirming or something more neutral. And again, the goal is not to pay attention to the 1,000 calories versus the 200 calories, but to the kinds of things you're thinking and feeling during that eating behavior. Also in stage 1, by self-monitoring, the client and the therapist begin to detect patterns in the client's eating disordered behavior. For example, the client may discover that he or she always binges at night, maybe while watching TV. I can't help it when I sit down. I just sit down with a bag of chips or nachos, and I just start eating them, and I just eat them straight forward all the way through. Or they might find that they eat when they go over to people's houses, or when they go to parties and there's food spread out on the table. or at certain restaurants like at the smorgasbord or an all-you-can-eat buffet. And what happens is the client begins to recognize those contexts that sort of trigger, facilitate, or enable binges or disturbed eating more generally. It brings into conscious awareness the kind of patterns related to disturbed eating. In cognitive behavioral treatment of eating disorder, depending on the situation, the client, and the particular eating disorder, the client may be instructed to weigh themselves on a limited basis, for example, only once a week. For some eating disorder clients, they may weigh themselves up to several times a day if they aren't prohibited from doing so. And again, the goal here is to really take away and to strip the person of this kind of chronic dietary consciousness and vigilance around weight and pay attention instead to the disturbed emotional patterns that serve to fan the flames or fuel the fire. Clients are educated in cognitive behavioral therapy about normal variations in weight, and they're encouraged to accept a weight range instead of a specific number. The notion is that we weigh slightly more or slightly less in the morning or at night, before or after dinner, before or after we exercise. From one day to the next, from 1 week to the next, there may be some fluctuations in weight, and it doesn't mean that because you've gained a pound or lost a pound that you're necessarily out of control, out of whack, or becoming fat. What it means is that everyone varies to some extent, to a greater or lesser extent in their weight, and the goal is to remain in a healthy range of weight and not at a specific number. So what you're trying to do is undo the notion that if I am 140 or more, I'm a fat pig, and only if I'm 139 or less am I acceptable. That's this kind of all or nothing style of thinking. I'm either at my weight or I'm over my weight. The former is good, the latter is bad. And instead, we're looking at a range of weight, which is acceptable. It's fine. It's okay. I'm in the corridor. The client also in stage 1 is educated about healthy weight regulation, about the negative effects of rigid dieting, fasting, and binge eating, and the adverse effects associated with various purging techniques. In other words, weight regulation, as we've talked about previously, requires the regular infusion of calories. Caloric intake needs to be reasonably continuous, consistent, and robust, or else the body goes into a kind of hibernation metabolism in which it absorbs and utilizes relatively little of the food because it anticipates that no more is coming. When it does come, then the body feasts on it, not knowing when the next meal is coming, so everything gets absorbed and weight is gained more quickly and more rapidly. So by learning about weight regulation, the client can come to understand that by eating regularly and consistently rather than yo-yo dieting, they actually will wind up weighing less than if they fast for a long period of time and then wind up gorging in compensation. Similarly, the notion about rigid dieting is to include in the diet a range of novel, interesting foods, different textures and flavors, and learn that food can be an enjoyable and pleasurable part of life, not something that needs to be rigidly controlled and feared. And of course, as we've talked about before, understanding the sort of medical risks associated with various kinds of purging techniques, the use of diuretics, the use of laxatives, the overuse of laxatives, the self-induced vomiting, and the erosion of tooth enamel. And so the notion here is to just recognize that these things do have consequences, some of them short-term and some of them long-term. Clients in cognitive behavioral therapy oftentimes are prescribed a regular eating schedule. By that I mean they are told they need to eat 3 meals a day, plus, for example, 2 small planned snacks. Many eating disorder clients otherwise tend to eat sporadically. They tend to fast for periods of time and then to gorge in compensation for that fasting, which then, of course, trips another fast, which then makes it more likely that eventually when they break the fast that they will gorge. And so they tend to eat inconsistently up and down, all or nothing. The goal with the regular eating is to provide 3 balanced meals that are nutritious and flavorful and prevent hunger from occurring and a person eating out of a sense of being famished or starved. That's why you have the couple of small snacks. The client, of course, at first may be terrified about gaining weight with the idea of eating 3 regular meals plus a couple of small snacks. But they soon come to realize that more regular eating patterns actually reduce binges, and as a result, they reduce overall caloric intake. Particularly if you can eat 3 regular meals a day, better say 300, 400, 500 calories each, rather than, and in compensation for and replacing, say, a binge of 2 boxes of Twinkies, a loaf of bread, a full frozen pizza, and a carton of ice cream, which may be several thousand calories. So you can see that the positive trade-off, the cost benefit, is vastly more favorable in relation to preventing the binges and eating consistently. And in stage 1, finally, clients are allowed, oftentimes at first, to eat small amounts of safe foods. Lists are made about foods that feel safe and foods that feel unsafe or scary or out of control. And so if the client is reluctant to eat those 3 meals at first, or the 2 small snacks, what you do is you infuse those meals with safe foods, foods that feel like they're not going to invite the person to get out of control. Fruits and vegetables are good examples. Sometimes clients, particularly anorectic clients, can complain about feeling uncomfortably full. The therapist then talks to them about the subjective feeling of fullness, that it's not a bad thing, it's an unfamiliar thing because you're accustomed to having a complete void in your stomach, a hole in your stomach, an empty stomach. So when you eat, you're going to have the sensation of fullness. But the truth of the matter is, this too shall pass. It's a good feeling, it's a appropriate feeling. It may feel like a little pressure, it may feel like a little ball of food in there, a tightness or tautness, but it too will pass and it will dissipate. So just relax, give it a half hour or so, and you'll find that you will return to not feeling full. They're encouraged to wait out these initially unpleasant feelings that oftentimes are attended by a sense of anxiety. I'm full, I'm anxious. And sometimes it's helpful to actually engage during that time in some distracting activities. So you eat and then you distract yourself by becoming involved in doing something, listening to music, watching TV, reading, doing a favorite craft or hobby, those kinds of things, because it can be a way of distracting you and helping you to learn to tolerate that unpleasant sense of fullness, and particularly to overcome the anxiety associated with it as you gradually learn to habituate to that feeling. That is, you just simply get used to it across time, and after a few weeks, that feeling is not as disturbing as it is at first. The therapist and the client together plan a variety of strategies to regain self-control when the client feels the need to or urge to engage in disordered eating behavior, whether that is a profound restricting like an anorexia or a binging or purging in a bulimic disorder. And so the notion is, well, what do we do when I start to feel the need to binge? What do I do? And of course, if you've been following your patterns, then you recognize times of day, context, places that you're most likely to run afoul of these urges, and there's also a preventative element. Clients are asked to identify high-risk situations for engaging in eating disorder behavior and to generate a list of alternatives that are pleasurable and feasible but will not exacerbate the eating disorder behavior. So you begin to learn that you are most at risk for binging, for example, after you call home and your mother or your father guilt trip you and you feel horrible, you feel bad. Or after you fight with your boyfriend or girlfriend and you're all emotionally upset. Or after you perform poorly on an exam and you feel very depressed and down on yourself. Or when you're alone in the apartment or in your dorm at night by yourself and no one else is around. Or when you're at a party and there's just no one's paying attention to anything, everyone's just talking, and there's a huge spread of junk food. So you begin to learn the context that represent high-risk situations, and the notion then is that you list a whole variety of things that you can do at those times that are pleasurable and feasible but will not make the eating disorder behavior worse. So, for example, you may regard going to the beach as pleasurable, but probably that's not feasible at the moment that you're at a party or the moment that you're at your house alone at night. So it has to be a feasible activity. And of course, it has to not exacerbate eating disorder behavior. You may regard a bowl of ice cream as a pleasurable experience, but the chances are that it is going to add insult to injury in relation to your disordered eating, not actually calm you or in any way, shape, or form substitute for your anxiety. It's going to fan the flames and not douse the fire. So you may have a variety of things like taking a leisurely walk, listening to music, talking to a friend on the phone, giving them a call, taking a calming bath or shower, reading a book, taking part in a favorite hobby. So these would be small, available, pleasurable, concrete things that you could do at those high-risk moments or times that when those moments or times could not be prevented, these are strategies you could deploy to get you through the 5 minutes or hour that is the sort of high-risk period of time. Clients are also taught what's called stimulus control and stimulus control techniques. The notion is that our behaviors, in this case disordered behaviors, are oftentimes related to particular contexts or particular triggers or events. This is the notion of a stimulus control, that it's something that you do is always associated with a particular person, a particular time, a particular place, a particular context. And this could be anything, of course. The stimulus could be something like being alone. It could be a particular kind of food, like every time I just see a Twinkie, I feel like I am out of control. I feel like I see a box of Captain Crunch, I see a scoop of ice cream, and it just makes me just want to gobble it down. So it could be particular foods, it could be particular places, and or it could be particular people for that matter. Many years ago, I worked in a VA medical center in a chemical dependency unit, and one of the unit leaders um, talked about he was a recovering alcoholic, and he talked about stimulus control, and he said for 3 or 4 years after he stopped drinking, he had to drive home a different way. He could not go past his familiar and frequented liquor store because simply driving past that liquor store was too alluring. It was too tempting. It was too seductive. He would just find himself, just automatically turning into the parking lot and then going and getting something to drink. So this is that notion of stimulus control. It has such incredible power over you. Similarly, when people engage in other habit control forms of intervention, oftentimes they will use stimulus control to their advantage. So in behavioral therapy, for example, of things like smoking, a person is taught that they can smoke but only in a given room, in a given chair in the house. And so all of their smoking is limited to that one location, and oftentimes then to one time, and then gradually it's sort of controlled and faded out. So you learn that smoking occurs only here and then and nowhere else at no other time. This is the positive use of stimulus control. Well, what are some other examples of this? Well, limiting the availability of binge foods in the house, avoiding shopping for foods. For example, if you are in the store and you're going down the aisle and you go past the Hostess cupcakes, sometimes somebody who binges on those will just feel the urge to grab them. You go past the cereal and you see the Trix or the Captain Crunch or the cookies and cream, and those are your favorite binge foods. You just feel like they're beckoning out to you. It's like Odysseus and the Siren's song. You just have to put wax in your ears, tie yourself to the mast, and just struggle to prevent yourself from responding to purchasing them. So what you do is you bring a friend with you, or you go ahead and you make sure you have a meal before you go so you're not the least bit hungry. In other words, you're trying to overcome some of this stimulus control, keeping the junk foods out of your house so that when you have a high-risk situation, you're alone, it's at night, you have a bad day, you have a bad experience in talking to a boyfriend, girlfriend, family member, then you can more easily overcome the urge to binge because the food is not readily available. When I say limiting media consumption, what I mean is that sometimes people will have magazines around their house and it shows these smiling, happy, stick-thin women. And there's a fair amount of research that shows that particularly as young women and adolescent girls look at these magazines, they do an implicit comparison with themselves, and they oftentimes feel badly as a result of reviewing these magazines. Same thing with websites. You see lots of pictures of svelte, thin, happy, successful, attractive girls and women, and then you think about yourself, what you look like, what you feel like, how you feel you look, and it feels as if there's an unfavorable comparison. So instead of making you feel good, they make you feel bad. And so sometimes it's helpful just to get those magazines out of the apartment and out of the dorm. They're not doing you any good right now. Getting rid of the scale in their homes is another way to engage in sort of stimulus control. A lot of times when people with eating disorders see the scale, number one, they feel the urge to weigh themselves. And number two, even before they do, it's an emotionally charged object. Simply looking at that reminds me that I am fat, reminds me that I feel fat, reminds me that I'm out of control, reminds me that I am a pig, reminds me that I am a hog, reminds me that I am a monster. And so it just has these really bad associations with it. So even seeing the scale, much less using the scale, can be adverse. So a lot of times the therapist will say, bring me your scale. We will have it in here, and you can weigh yourself in here every time you visit me. But in the meantime, I don't want you looking at that scale, and I don't want you using that scale at the house. And obviously, we're talking about then trying to provide ways to resist purchasing fast foods and instead to avoid fast foods and avoid foods that you typically use for fasting, like buying copious amounts of carrots or buying copious amounts of celery that have relatively limited. Carrots have nutritional value, celery has little, but avoiding purchasing those things in a way that would encourage you to fill yourself on things that had limited or restricted nutritional value. So you're just, again, avoiding those high-risk things that would lead to your restriction or would lead to your binging. In stage 2, by this time, the clients will have an understanding of the relationship between the restricting and binging and recognize that the restricting leads to binging and the binging leads to subsequent restricting. Clients are asked at this point to generate a list of a wide variety, for example, 40 forbidden foods, those things that they've been avoiding, that they're fearful of, that they're terrified of, that they feel at the mercy of, that they feel vulnerable in relation to, those things that they fear that if they ate, they would get completely out of control or that it would trigger a binge or a purge. I cannot eat a Twinkie without inducing vomiting because once I eat one, I can't stop until I finish the box. So there's never a time in which I eat a Twinkie that I don't wind up inducing vomiting. This would be an example of a forbidden food. Now, of course, some foods are more forbidden than others, and some invite greater discontrol, being out of control more than others. And so clients, for that reason, then, are asked to sort of rank the foods from the least threatening at the bottom to the most threatening, and then they're instructed to include them progressively in their meals from the least to the most threatening. So, for example, the Twinkie or ice cream or a box pizza may be high on the list, and low on the list may be something like a piece of toast with peanut butter on it. Well, it may be for that reason that I'm not going to then invite you to put a box of Twinkies on your diet. I'm not going to invite you to put a carton of ice cream or, just get one big scoop out. It's fine. We're really playing with fire there. So instead, I will say, well, let's introduce the peanut butter. I tell you what, as one of your snacks in the afternoon, let's go ahead and just have a couple of peanut butter crackers. It's not a full slice of bread, and you just say a couple. You don't want to restrict it and say 1 1/2 or 3/4 of one cracker, but you just want to say a couple crackers with peanut butter on it, and let's just see how that goes. So it's including or infusing some relatively unsafe foods. It's not like carrots, it's not like celery, it's maybe not like an apple or an orange, but it's not also like a Twinkie or like a carton of maybe cereal or of ice cream. And so clients then are invited to progressively include one or two and then increasingly more of these more unsafe foods into their diet. The goal here is to experiment with modest amounts of these previously forbidden foods until again the client is no longer anxious about losing control when they eat them. Essentially, they're habituating to the anxiety associated with them, because before, the piece of toast with peanut butter on it would lead to a second piece of toast with peanut butter, which would lead to a third. And then once I had done that, I just started cramming my face with the remaining loaf of bread. And then once I finish that, then I'm completely out of control, and I go to the waffles in the ice box, and I start just slamming them down into the toaster. And then as they're toasting, I just start eating the remainder of the box of raw waffles, just chonking them down without even thinking about what I'm eating. So what's happened is that they have learned that the toast with peanut butter on it is a prelude to, it's a harbinger of a binge. And so you're unlearning that by doing controlled eating around these relatively safe foods, that I can eat these and it will not lead to a complete uncontrolled binge. Clients are also encouraged to eat under a wide range of different circumstances than they might otherwise have eaten, including some previously avoided circumstances. So they may eat in restaurants, they may eat at other people's houses, and these are contexts in which you may not have complete control. When you order a meal, they serve you maybe more food than you would like. They may serve you food that is relatively dangerous food. That is, things that you wouldn't eat on your own or take on your own plate. And the same thing at other people's houses. So you're infusing novelty into your diet in relation to what you eat, and you're also increasing the variety of different contexts and places in which you eat. And the notion here again is that you're trying to overcome the rigidity, the structure, and the notion that if I stick to what I do, that is, when I eat, what I eat, then I am in control, but any variation of that leads me to being out of control and unregulated and wild abandon. So you're learning that you can have novelty, you can have variation, and not necessarily have a loss of control. Food then becomes less scary because in the other model, the previous model, any variation invites profound disorder. But now I'm having variation and I'm not having dysregulation. Clients in stage 2 are also taught problem-solving skills. Problem-solving skills involve first identifying and specifying a particular problem behavior. So, for example, it might be that when I sit down to eat a potato chip, I wind up eating the whole bag. Or I will open a bag of Cheetos and I'll try to eat 3 or 4 of them, and before you know it, I have eaten the whole bag. I can never open a bag, no matter how large of a family pack it is, without consuming the entire bag of chips. So that's a problem behavior. Number 2, generating different ways of coping with this behavior. So the client and the therapist talk about how it is that I can manage to open a bag and have a few chips without eating all the bag. And then you evaluate the feasibility and the likely effectiveness of each of these possible solutions. Well, so for example, I might say, in relation to the bag of chips notion, as a therapist, I'd say, well, gosh, what do you think about opening the bag of salt and vinegar chips and pull out 5 chips, close the bag and put it away, and take the 5 chips with you over to your table or your chair or the couch. It could be 10 chips, it could be 20 chips. The number of chips is not relevant. What's relevant is that you stop at the end of whatever that number is. And then when you evaluate the feasibility of that, the client says, right, yeah, right. As soon as I eat those 5 chips, 10 chips, 20 chips, all that's going to do is whet my appetite, and by then I will be frenzied, and I will go over and I will just absolutely nosh down that entire bag. I will just I will crumble them up and just dump the bag into my mouth, and I will just gorge. Well, so this is an example of a problem-solving strategy, but in evaluating its feasibility and probable effectiveness, it proves not to be very useful. So we abandon that strategy and we think of another one. Another one, for example, might be that you simply buy one small bag of chips, that is one of those little 25 or 59-cent bags of chips, and you don't buy any more than that. And you go to the store, you get that, so that when you sit down to eat the chips, you can eat that bag, but no more. There's no more to eat in the house. What is the feasibility and likely effectiveness of that as a strategy? Well, that's a lot higher, because for me to continue that particular binge, I would then have to go ahead and hop in the car and go down to the store, and I'd be less likely to do that. After evaluating a range of different alternatives, then the person chooses the best alternative and specifies how it would be implemented, how they would employ it, how they would use it, and then you carry that out next time you confront, in this case, the bag of chips, and you evaluate the effectiveness of having chosen that strategy. So you come back in, you bought the one bag of Doritos, the one little bag, individual serving bag of salt and vinegar, and you say, yes, this week I did eat that bag. I bought a single bag. I brought it home. I intentionally ate it that night, and I didn't eat anything more. And it felt so good to have a bag of chips and not wind up having a giant binge. Cognitive restructuring is the real engine of cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive restructuring involves teaching the client to become, first of all, aware of some negative feeling and thoughts, oftentimes repetitive thoughts in their minds, and then to challenge these and to change them to more accurate and more constructive thoughts. So, for example, a client is taught to pay attention to their mood. I feel down, I feel sad, I feel depressed, I feel angry, I feel upset, I feel anxious. So they're taught to pay attention to what it is they feel. When they feel some powerful negative emotion, they're then invited to record what it is they're thinking. And at first it may seem as if they're thinking nothing. That is, I just feel bad. A big ball of bad, a big ball of anxious. But as you pay attention to it, you begin to realize there are thoughts, maybe self-loathing, self-reproach. I hate myself. I'm such a pig. I'm so worthless. These are these automatic thoughts that are so incredibly well practiced and well rehearsed that they occur without even thinking about it. They've become telescoped down into something that occurs in a nanosecond. But if you concentrate on that feeling and the thoughts associated with that feeling, you'll recognize that those thoughts are there, and the clients are asked then to record those, to write those down. So they feel bad, then they wind up finding out that they say to themselves things like, I'm worthless, I'm such a jerk, I'm so stupid, I can't believe this, what's the matter with me? So there's all these kinds of thoughts. Then they're asked to evaluate those thoughts. What about those thoughts is true? What's not true? What's correct? What's incorrect? What's rational? What's irrational? And then to change them to fit a more rational, more realistic appraisal. And to make note then of how that change registers in relation to their feelings. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a second. In order to be able to identify your patterns of thinking, clients are oftentimes first taught about 10 common cognitive distortions, and then they're asked to specify their problematic thoughts and the context in which these thoughts occurred. Clients are then instructed again to dispute the validity of these thoughts and to evaluate the evidence both for and against those and come to a reasoned, more rational restructuring of those thoughts. But you can see that the awareness of the cognitive distortions is a key engine, a pivotal point in cognitive therapy. The 10 cognitive distortions consist of, first, all or nothing thinking. This is thinking that something has to be exactly a certain way or else it is a complete failure. Unless I make an A on the test, I'm a loser. And so it's either I succeed or I fail. I'm either above my weight or I'm below it. If I'm above it, I'm a fat pig. If I'm below it, then I am in control. So this is all or nothing thinking. This is black or white. He loves me or he doesn't love me. She likes me or she doesn't like me. I'm great or I'm horrible. I either win or I lose. I'm either successful or I'm a failure. There are no shades of gray. And so Clients oftentimes need to be taught that there are shades of gray, and in truth, most of the life experience occurs in the shades of gray. A B plus is not an A, but it really is also not a D. A C is not a failure. On the other hand, it's not a B. So there are shades of gray. And if you get an E, it's harder to recover from that in your grade than getting a C. So there are shades of gray that really do matter. It's not a success or a failure, a win or a lose, an all or a nothing. Selective abstraction, or the mental filter, is literally sort of focusing on one small detail of an event or situation, usually that supports a negative pattern of thinking or failure. So, for example, somebody may say, everyone said that I look great at the party tonight, but John looked at me funny, so I must be hideous. If you have ever been to a party or to a social kind of gathering with somebody who is characteristic in this regard, using selective abstraction mental filter, you will recognize this immediately. You go to the party, they go to the same party. You have a good time, you dance, you talk with people, you eat food, you have something to drink. You come back and you have a great time. But maybe your ears are ringing, the music's a little loud. The person you go with says, I can't believe how loud that music was. I mean, I could barely think. I couldn't talk. I had to scream. It was so unpleasant. I mean, the entire time, all I was thinking is, I just have to get out of here. I can't believe she turned the music up so loud. It was ridiculous. And they just go on and on and on and on and perseverate. And you say, well, what about that wine? And they go, I couldn't even pay attention to the wine. What about, did you meet so-and-so? No, I couldn't talk to anybody. So you've had a variety of positive experiences that have offset this one negative thing, but for them, that one negative thing is all they concentrate on. They selectively abstract a single thing. They have a mental filter that favors recalling the negative and discounting or disqualifying the positive. Overgeneralization is exactly what the name implies. It's making a rule based on one or on a few events. So, for example, if you can't answer a question in class, then you say something like, I must be terrible in psychology. So, you get a question wrong, you say, oh my God, if I can't answer that, I can't answer anything. If I can't answer anything, I'm going to fail this class. If I fail this class, I can't be a psych major. I'll fail out of school. If I fail out of school, I'll be a complete failure. So before you know it, you've gone from not being able to answer a question to not being able to successfully live life. This is overgeneralization, making a sweeping conclusion based on very scant, isolated evidence. Another of the cognitive distortions is related, and that's discounting the positives. Discounting the positives is simply ignoring or discounting or disqualifying everything good about yourself. Sure, Mary said that I was sensitive, but who cares about that? Or what does she know? So it's not being able to absorb or take in or take to heart favorable things, but only those things that are unfavorable. Jumping to conclusions, as the name implies, is jumping to a conclusion that's simply not supported by available evidence. There are a couple of variants on this concept of jumping to conclusions. One is called the fortune teller error. Here you predict that things are going to turn out badly before they even occur. So, for example, you're about to go up and give a speech and you think to yourself, I know my mind is going to go completely blank and I'll just look like an idiot. Everyone's going to be laughing at me and I'll be humiliated. Well, you haven't even gotten up to the podium yet. You haven't even stood up. You haven't even gotten out of your desk, and you already have created a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. You already are foretelling doom and gloom when there is at this point no evidence to support that at all. But what you're doing is you're manufacturing the evidence that ultimately could be causal in relation to your poor performance. So it's always predicting the worst, even when there isn't evidence favoring that. A variation on that, jumping to conclusions, is the mind reader error, and this is assuming that you know what somebody else is thinking. Of course, usually we're talking about things that are negative. Look at everybody staring at me. They must think I'm horribly obese. They must think I am a fat pig. They must think I am a bad person. They must think I look odd. Well, the truth is you don't know what they think, but this is a conclusion that you jump to. You're not jumping to the notion about, oh, look at them, look at me, they must think I'm hot. You're not thinking that, you're thinking the worst. So if you take a mind reader error and you turn it in the positive direction, you can see, and clients will sometimes smile, to how ridiculous it is. That is, it doesn't seem truthful when you frame it positively because you really don't have any evidence for that, and that highlights the fact that when you give it a negative spin, you similarly are doing that just automatically and characteristically, not on the basis of evidence, but on the basis of feeling. I feel conspicuous, so I must look stupid. This is the mind reader error. You go to a party, and as you walk in, there's a group of people that you walk up to, and they get quiet and kind of spread apart and allow you to enter the circle. And you say to yourself, oh my God, they must have been talking about me because as soon as I walked up, they all shut up. Well, it could be, it's not impossible that that's the case. On the other hand, it's just as likely that it was a gesture of respect that they were letting you into the circle. And so there's a pause in conversation as they say hello to you and incorporate you into the conversation. The magnification and catastrophizing or minimalizing has to do with the basic pattern of exaggerating things that support a particular negative view of yourself, while you minimize evidence that supports your good qualities. Again, this is a variation or combination of some of the other distortions, cognitive distortions. So you may say to yourself, I did all right on that test, but it was just dumb luck. Everyone else here is a genius compared to me. I am so stupid. Several weeks ago, I took a group of high school kids, juniors, to the university for a Saturday SAT test. And one of the kids, as we were out on Turnitin Plaza, waiting, queued up to get checked in for the SAT, one of them looked around at all these other high school students from around various counties, and he said, I bet I am the stupidest person here. I bet I'm the dumbest guy here. Well, this is an example of catastrophizing, and there's absolutely no evidence for that. He just didn't feel smart and was anxious and concerned. So if I feel anxious, I must be stupid. Should statements are just that. Should statements oftentimes people use in order to motivate themselves. You should do this. You ought to do that. You must do that. Albert Ellis talked about shoulding on yourselves or masturbating. The notion is that you are taking almost a moral stand of imperative. You're moving yourself into a moral domain. That is, I should have done this. I should have studied more. I should have asked her out. I should have washed my clothes. I should have stopped eating. I should have not bought that food. The notion here is that you're taking something that ought to be, that could be descriptive, and you're moving it instead into a moral thing. And when you fail in a moral domain, then you are wrong. You've done something wrong. And you can tell this because when people use a lot of should statements, a lot of oughts, a lot of must, it's as if you almost need to be punished in order to impel yourself to take some kind of action or initiative. When these musts or shoulds are directed toward yourself, then they oftentimes produce guilt. Think about that. I should have done this. I should not have done that. And then the failure to fulfill that results in you feeling badly about yourself. You're feeling guilty. I should never have bought the Captain Crunch, but you bought the 10 boxes of Captain Crunch, so now you feel guilty. When shoulding is directed toward other people, it oftentimes produces anger. My roommate should never have bought that Captain Crunch, so now I'm anger. My anger is at her. I'm angry at her because she shouldn't have done that. Well, again, it's a moral imperative, and a breach or a failure in relation to this really feels like there is a wrongdoing, an act of moral turpitude. Somebody has done something wrong. I really should do my homework. I am so lazy. He really should ask if I'm feeling okay. What an insensitive jerk. Again, shoulding yourself results in guilt. Shoulding other people results in anger. Sometimes it's helpful to try to encourage clients to change every time they hear a should statement, to change it to a could statement. It's a single letter, changing an SH actually to a C, but what happens is that it changes the entire meaning. I I should have bought fruit. I could have bought fruit. I shouldn't have bought the Captain Crunch. I could not have bought the Captain Crunch. It takes the imperative out of it. It takes the must out of it. And so it tends to blunt the associated feeling of anger or guilt. The last few of the cognitive distortions have to do with labeling or mislabeling, and this is basically name-calling. It's creating a negative view of yourself or other people based on perceived errors or mistakes. Gee, I couldn't exercise the willpower not to eat that donut. I am such a weak-willed slob. Now here you are literally calling yourself a name, a weak-willed slob. So this one behavior turns you into something that you are. So now it's no longer about what you did, it's now about what you are. You see somebody eating an ice cream cone and you are anorectic, and I've seen this many times with anorectic women, and they will say, look at that pig, look at that sow, what a porker. And they just have this derision, and it's really almost a character assassination. It's not there is no empathy, there is no sympathy, there is no humanity. The person has just turned into not a person who's enjoying an ice cream cone, but really a despicable, monstrous creature who lacks self-control. And so it becomes a character assassination. It's as labeling them or name-calling. Personalization is making an event that's completely unrelated to you personally relevant, meaningful, or significant. So you go to a conference and they don't serve lunch, and you say, I guess they're not serving lunch because they know what a pig I am. Well, they're not serving lunch because they're not serving lunch. It has nothing to do with you, but it feels personal. That is, you go out of your way to make it personal. Did you see what Sarah wore? She knows red is my favorite color. Do you see what she said? She sidled up to Steve, as if that's her boyfriend. That's not her boyfriend. And it may not be a personal act at all. It's simply an act, and it's taken personally. Everything is taken personally. It's all about me. And of course, it's typically the bad stuff that is all about me. And finally, emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning is assuming that just because you feel a certain way, it must be true. I feel like a fat slob, therefore I must be a fat slob. I feel like such an idiot, so I must be really stupid. This is a really difficult one, emotional reasoning, because the person feels that because they feel worthless, they must be worthless. Because they feel anxious, they must be a timid person. Because they feel guilty, they must have done something wrong. But oftentimes feelings don't covary or correspond with reality. So again, in a cognitive behavioral form of treatment, the goal and role is going to be to dispute, to investigate, to explore, to test out, and then ultimately to dispute fallacious, erroneous, or irrational thoughts. In this second stage of cognitive restructuring, then, it can oftentimes be quite helpful if the client writes down a record of the problematic thoughts during the day to bring into the session. Many therapists give clients a daily record of dysfunctional thoughts, oftentimes called a log. It could be a journal. It could be a thought monitoring sheet. But basically, it's a homework sheet that they take home and that they fill out that describes their thoughts, the emotions, the evidence for or against the thought, and the cognitive distortion used, and then results in a more rational, appropriate statement that is restructured to correspond to the way things really are. So you feel really badly about yourself, you're down, you're depressed, and you're kind of angry. And then you take note of your thoughts. So you write down your feelings, and you might write down the intensity of that feeling on a 1 to 10. I'm angry and I'm depressed. I'm depressed at an 8, I'm angry at a 9. And then you think, what is it that I'm thinking? And you find yourself thinking, I am such an idiot. I am just a big fat slob. I can't do anything. Every time I eat anything, I eat everything. What is the matter with me? I must be crazy. So these are the thoughts that you have. And then you examine the evidence in favor of and opposed to those. Every time I eat anything, I eat everything. Well, no, that's not true. Sometimes when I eat anything, I eat everything. But, I'll binge once or twice a week, but I'm eating 15 or 20 times a week. So it is true that occasionally I do binge and I do lose control, but it's also the case that oftentimes I eat and I don't lose control. Similarly, I must be crazy. Well, the truth of the matter is I may have some challenges around eating and around retaining control, so there may be something wrong. That doesn't make me crazy. I'm not going to be institutionalized. This is a problem that the truth is that it is a problem, and the truth is that I am seeking help for that problem. That's a very different thing from just saying I am crazy. What's the matter with me? I'm crazy. So you go through and you point out the truth and the falseness of each of your thoughts, and then you go back and you revisit how you feel. You restructure those thoughts into rational, realistic, valid, correct ones that correspond to reality. The truth is that sometimes I do lose control of my eating, and I oftentimes retain control of my eating. The truth is I do have a problem with eating, and I am seeking help for that. People can get help, and they do recover. So these would be examples of rational restructurings of these otherwise sort of runaway, distorted cognitions. And then you take stock again of your feelings, of your level of anger, of your level of depression. Maybe the depression has gone down from an 8 to a 5 or a 6. Maybe the anger has gone down from a 9 to, say, a 5 or 6 or 7. The point is not necessarily to eliminate those emotions, but to regulate those emotions, to move them down into a normal, more acceptable range. And if they've moved from an average of an 8 or a 9 to an average of a 5 or a 6, that's a good positive change. It's moving you in the right direction, particularly if it's moving you to the level of emotions that don't regulate or control your behavior, but allow you to regulate or control them. Another strategy that can be employed during this second stage is to use the principle of exposure to a feared stimulus. So, for example, you could ask an anorectic woman to gradually wear tighter or more revealing, close-fitting clothing. Anorectics oftentimes will wear baggy clothes in order to protect themselves against the surveillance and critique of other people who find them too thin and are likely to make note to them like, gosh, you need to gain some weight, you're getting too thin, and so forth. So the notion here is that you encourage them to take off the extra large sweatshirt and to wear instead regular fitting sweater or just a long sleeve blouse, and so it slightly more fits the contour of the body more, and they then may have to process the negative thoughts that this invites. As long as they're protecting themselves by virtue of wearing big, large, billowy things, then they're not having to confront the concerns or thoughts about other people's appraisal of them. But once they start to wear more form-fitting things, then they have these thoughts. And I assure you those thoughts are then something that can be contended against. Instead of being protected from or avoided, you're now sort of inviting them, like, oh, I wonder if people are looking at me. I know I must look very thin to them. I know they're going to say something. They must think I'm terrible. They must think I'm a monster. And so you quite literally are inviting your own cognitions or concerns so that you can habituate to them and so that you can successfully restructure them. You also could encourage people to look at themselves in the mirror and to recite positive affirmations. So you look in the mirror, and instead of saying, oh my God, you fat slob, oh my goodness gracious, look at your fat gut, your big thighs, your big fat butt, what's the matter with you? You are a fat sow. You need to change. You need to starve yourself because you are hideous. You are despicable. Instead, you are saying things like, not bad, or this is fine, or I'm okay, or I am beautiful. So again, what you're doing is you are encountering the image rather than avoiding the image, and you are pairing it with positive, affirming rather than negative and disconfirming thoughts. You can also encourage the person to compare their body shapes and weights with other people who are attractive, with the goal of realizing that not all attractive people are flawless. Attractive people also have some flaws. So you can have them look through magazines, you can have them look at images and note the imperfections, but the person is nonetheless attractive. They can be attractive and imperfect. So it breaks this notion that in order to be attractive, I must be perfect. And many people with particularly anorexia, are really striving for perfection. That is, perfect thinness. Enough is never enough. I am always imperfect. I am always ugly. I am always flawed and marred in some way, shape, or form. And here is a recognition that you can actually be flawed and marred, and you can be imperfect, and you can still be attractive. You can still be desirable. You can still be acceptable. You can still be lovable. In the third stage of cognitive behavioral therapy is really relapse prevention. And here the client is encouraged to anticipate specific difficulties after therapy ends that and to develop various ways of coping with or strategies for coping with those. So for example, you may encourage a person to fast forward to spring break or to the end of the term in the summer when she might want to buy a swimming suit, and she knows this is going to be an emotionally charged event. I know when it comes time for spring break, all my friends are going to the beach. I'm going to get a new swimming suit, and I'm going to hate myself. I know I'm going to be looking endlessly for something that doesn't show these deposits of hanging fat, these poochy parts of my waist or my butt. I'm going to try to find something that covers my entire body like an old-fashioned swimming suit, and I'm going to hate myself. And so you can fast forward to that time, and you can identify ways that you can again restructure cognitions or engage in various strategies to get through that event. The goal is not necessarily, again, to be able to get through the event without feeling any anxiety, without feeling any concern. Nobody is expecting that you necessarily would go swimsuit shopping if you have an eating disorder with no emotional feelings whatsoever, but that it is an acceptable event. It's something you can successfully cope with. The therapist may normalize that the client could experience occasional setbacks, and that it doesn't mean that this necessarily means that they're on the track for failure. Again, this is trying to break that all or nothing thinking. If I have a relapse, if I binge, if I become anxious, if I become depressed, then I am back to square one. No, in truth, the way change works is there are ups and downs. There's a roller coaster of ups and downs. It's not a linear process. It's not a straightforward process. You have peaks and you have valleys. And so, like the old adage about one swallow doesn't make a summer, one setback doesn't make a complete failure. In fact, you can learn from your setbacks, and the goal is just that. Look, I'm expecting that you will have relapses. I expect when you buy a swimming suit, when you walk out on the beach in your new swimming suit, or whatever, you are going to have you may experience some anxiety, you may experience some panic, you may feel some depression, but these are precisely the opportunities that you need to be able to cope with those feelings. These, in some ways, you can view them as setbacks. In other ways, you can view them as opportunities. So our goal is to see that you can get through those, and if you can get through them rather than avoid them, if you can have a success rather than a failure, then that's all the greater success for the setback or for the powerful negative feelings associated with them. So you normalize the fact that change occurs in ups and downs, peaks and valleys, forwards and backwards motions. The client is oftentimes asked to prepare a written maintenance plan that he or she can follow at the end, and that maintenance plan can include a lot of different elements. It can include what's going to happen if problems recur. That is becoming aware of what's happening when it's happening, and what can I do about it. I'm feeling myself become more depressed. I'm feeling the urges to binge increase. I'm feeling the need to restrict, gain a grip over me. So, what will I do when these things occur? The goal here is we're trying to now stretch out the horizon of therapy. We are ending, our relationship is ending, our therapy is ending, but your process of change is continuing, and my sense is that you've gained enough control now, you've gained enough capability, enough mastery of these methods and these techniques and these interventions that for many weeks you've been employing them successfully on your own and coming back in to talk with me. And so now what we're doing is we're moving toward termination, and maybe you're coming in every other week, or maybe only checkups once a month, or maybe it's our final session. But you've demonstrated to me that you have the capacity to do these on your own. So let's talk through what you will do when you confront these various circumstances. You may want to reinstitute self-monitoring of the eating-related behaviors or circumstances under which they occur. You may want to ask the client to make an effort to follow the same kinds of steps that were successful in therapy, such as, for example, eating 3 meals a day with planned snacks. So you may, as you go toward termination, you may want to reinstate those things that have proven themselves to be effective, or simply rehearse them with the client and have them make a list of them so that as they encounter struggles after therapy, they have a set of things that they know have worked for them before. And you can say, listen, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, and if these three things have worked for you before, if you encounter these struggles in the future, let's go ahead and put these three back in this order. They worked for you before, they're likely to work for you again. Similarly, the client can use problem-solving strategies like we talked about to cope with various stressful issues. This was the bag of chips example. They can also reuse the cognitive restructuring activities, identifying their distortions and restructuring their cognitions accordingly. And importantly, they can set up short-term realistic goals, taking it a single day or, if need be, half day or an hour at a time, keeping in mind in all cases that one or more episodes of destructive, disordered eating, whether that's binge eating, fasting, or purging, does not mean that the client has necessarily relapsed or lost their therapeutic gains. What they may have experienced is a setback, but again, a setback can also be construed as an opportunity to practice the methods, to practice the interventions, to practice the forms of treatment that are part and parcel of successful cognitive behavioral therapy.